Black Sea, the Persian Gulf, and soon may happen in the South China Sea. The funeral of the Monroe Doctrine did not have a speech, or an anthem, or a flag at half-mast. It had an anchor dropped into Caribbean waters, not to start a war, but to show that a new kind of war no longer needs to be fought to be won, because sometimes all it takes is to arrive where the other power believed you could never stand. And once you stand there, even once the world is never the same again, empires rarely fall because they are defeated. They fall because they stop listening. And that is what happened to the United States after the Cold War. We believed power was permanent. We believed victory was final. We believed history had already chosen sides and that it had chosen ours forever. That belief created something deadly: strategic confidence without strategic curiosity. We no longer asked, what do other states need? We simply assumed they would adjust to us. That assumption cost us more than we realized. Because while Washington was expanding NATO, sanctioning adversaries, and spreading influence through coercion, other nations were watching and learning. They watched us occupy Iraq. They watched us pressure Iran. They watched us topple governments in Afghanistan and Libya. They watched us interfere in elections in Latin America and Eastern Europe. They watched us use economic warfare as a routine instrument of foreign policy, and one conclusion became unavoidable. If this is leadership, it is leadership based on fear. In international politics, states care about two things above all: their survival and their autonomy. Not democracy, not ideology, survival and autonomy. And when a state feels its autonomy is under threat, it will resist, even when resistance means hardship, sanctions, or isolation. It will seek partners. It will explore alternatives. It will reorganize its economy. It will accept short-term pain to preserve long-term sovereignty. That is how Russia adapted. That is how Iran adapted. That is how Venezuela adapted. And that is how rising powers like China prepared for a world where American dominance was no longer assumed but contested. Here is the greatest strategic irony of our era. The United States tried to enforce order, but ended up accelerating disorder. We tried tried to isolate adversaries, but pushed them into each other's arms. We tried to shape the world into one system, but help build a second one outside our control. We believed sanctions would break Venezuela. They built resilience. We believed NATO expansion would deter Russia. It provoked strategic response. We believed global pressure would keep China quiet. It awakened industrial consolidation. That is not defeat, but it is decline. Decline measured not in territory lost, but in predictability lost. And once predictability fades, security becomes harder to calculate. Let me pose a question. What is more dangerous to an empire? A powerful rival or a rival whose next move you cannot predict? When a rival is weak, you manage them. When a rival is strong, you negotiate with them. But when a rival is unpredictable, you hesitate. That hesitation is visible today in Washington. on military decisions, on sanctions, on diplomacy, on red lines that keep changing without clarity. And hesitation is the first sign of strategic insecurity. Some people call this moral decline. I don't. I call it what my field of international relations has always recognized: imperial overreach, the stretching of commitments beyond sustainable limits, the belief that being everywhere is the same as being effective. The confusion of moral language with strategic necessity. Empires that overextend do not crumble quickly. They erode slowly. They lose focus. They chase small fires while missing structural change. They stop planning grand strategy and begin reacting tactically. They start defending their narrative instead of adapting to the facts. And when that happens, a strange kind of decline emerges. A decline without defeat, a decline born from confidence, not from weakness. That is where the United States stands today. Still powerful, still wealthy, still capable of deterrence, but without the clarity that true power requires. No empire loses strength overnight. It loses direction first, then credibility, then initiative. And finally, its place. Not because someone took it, but because it no longer knew how to defend it. There is a phrase I use often with my students. Power is not what you hold, it's what you can keep without using it. When Russian ships docked in Venezuela, Washington did not stop them. Not because we didn't see them, not because we didn't care, but because confronting them would have exposed the limits of our reach. And limits in a global hegemon are the one thing you never want to reveal. That is why that port visit was more than a maneuver. It was a mirror. And in that mirror, American power saw something it had not seen in decades, a boundary. And boundaries are where strategy begins again. In international politics, power wears many masks. One of the most effective masks the United States ever created was narrative. When we acted abroad in Iraq, in Libya, in Chile, in Guatemala, in Panama, in Afghanistan, we never said it was for control. We said it was for freedom. We called it stability. We called it progress. We called it democracy. That language worked for a long time. It gave our strategy a moral shield. It allowed power to present itself as principle. But here is the danger with narrative. Once credibility disappears, your words stop protecting you. They start exposing you. And that is what slowly began to happen to American foreign policy in the early 2000s. Iraq asked a simple question: where are the weapons of mass destruction? They were never found. Libya asked another question: if you came to save us, why are we in civil war after your intervention? No answer came. Afghanistan, 20 years, trillions spent, and helicopters retreated from rooftops, just like Vietnam, just like history warned. In Latin America, people remembered Guatemala. They remembered Chile. They remembered Argentina. They remembered how U.S. support often arrived not as protection, but as pressure. They remembered how we backed dictators as long as they were anti-communist, and how we undermined democracies if they challenged our influence. Memory is one of the most powerful weapons in geopolitics, and memory had begun to turn against us. Sooner or later, the world began asking a question Washington never wanted to hear: is this really about democracy, or is it about dominance? Because when